From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. It's 2025, and witches are having a moment. Not only because Halloween is almost here. A recent Pew Research survey of Americans' religious beliefs found a growing number of people identify as spiritual but not religious. Crystals, tarot cards, and astrology apps are part of many people's lives. And in Colorado, about 1% of people in that survey checked the box for pagan, Wiccan, or other New Age belief. My guest today has a unique perspective on all of this. Ann Little is a professor of history at Colorado State University. Some of her courses explore witchcraft in early North America. Ann talked with me about what we can learn from studying the history of witches and why she was initially reluctant to teach a course about it.
I really resisted teaching the history of witchcraft for a number of years in my career because it seemed like such a cliche, right? Students who didn't know anything about early American history or about women in early America, the one thing they might know was about the Salem witchcraft accusations outbreak in 1692.
Sure.
My students, until about the last 5 or 10 years, when I would teach a little bit about witchcraft, they seemed very confident that we have science now, we have modernity, we know how the material world works, we would never be fooled into such a mobbing of individuals.
Right.
And I think that really what we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years really contradicts that. And I think the students see that now too.
When we talk about witches, the idea can be sort of romanticized these days, but you really point out how dangerous it was back in colonial America to be charged with witchcraft. Why were women the primary targets of these accusations?
Well, in part, these are Euro-American migrants from European backgrounds. This is how European witchcraft works. Women were suspected of witchcraft usually because they were suspected of diabolism, of channeling power from the natural world inappropriately, and usually with the help of Satan or the devil.
Wow. And what type of woman was most likely to be accused of witchcraft?
She was a postmenopausal woman who did not have sons who might inherit her estate. She might have daughters, she might have nieces, but she tended to not have male heirs who would end up taking charge of her economic estate, if she had an estate of any value, that is. But it's also about, I think, men in colonial Anglo-American society wanting to maintain control over resources and over power. And women who either channeled unnatural power through witchcraft or who had actual and potential economic power and influence over their heirs, especially female heirs, that was considered also sort of unnatural and inappropriate for women to have that kind of power.
Wow. Now, I mentioned a recent Pew Research survey that suggests today more people, especially younger people, are interested in alternative faiths like paganism or Wiccanism. Why do you think these beliefs appeal to people right now?
Well, I think this has to do with the broader trends of the secularization of American society that you mentioned earlier in your introduction. But I think just because we might have turned aside from Catholicism or Presbyterianism or Methodism or whatever mainstream Christian religion or other than Christian religion doesn't mean that we don't have a need for sort of answers to mysteries in our lives. And I think Americans we are a seeking people. We're curious. We want to know answers. We want to have a framework for making the world make sense. And I think this is an aspect of young people looking for answers and looking to try to make sense of a world that just seems to be sort of animated with a fire hose of digital information. And now we're facing the prospect of sort of wading through AI slop in our social media feeds and in our news feeds as well these days.
Well, you mentioned a digital kind of onslaught of information. When I think about how the Salem witch trials unfolded, it's kind of like conspiracy theory spreading online today. Could you talk about that and how you might put these events into that context?
Well, another feature that we see in a lot of modern day social contagions is that it's young women who are spreading these ideas and claiming to suffer from these afflictions and claiming to suffer at the hands of witches.
Yeah.
Young women, I think, are evolutionarily designed to seek out bonds with other women. And that's a strong survival feature of our species. But what that means is that there can be a lot of mob-directed behavior by young women that is not necessarily pro-social.
Can you say more about that mob behavior?
Well, I think we know this from other, teenage social contagions like anorexia nervosa and bulimia in the 1980s and the 1990s. The way that cutting as a way to deal with emotional distress has spread among the same population in the 90s and the 2000s. Young women sometimes get really deeply invested in practices and unhealthy beliefs. And they can spread these ideas really widely through their social networks, even without, digital connections.
So getting back to the witch trials, I think mainly of this happening in Massachusetts, New England area. Did this kind of hysteria spread to Colorado and the West later on?
It did. There's a big outbreak of witchcraft around the New Mexican town of Abiquiu. It's not far from the Albuquerque and Santa Fe area. It was a town, a mixed town of Hispanos and Native Americans. And there was a big witchcraft outbreak in the 1760s and 1770s. But Spanish, Latin American witchcraft was different from Anglo-American witchcraft in that it tended to revolve around sort of ideas about romance, putting a curse on someone who's your romantic rival for some man's affection, perhaps, or to make somebody fall in love with you, or recipes for love potions. So Latin American witchcraft, at least the Native American sort of inflected kind, seemed to be a little less focused on sin and relationships with the devil. That was a particularly Anglo-American fascination.
What do you think most surprises students in your class about the history of witches?
I think they still are struck by how could a whole society be taken up by such a, in their view, an obviously ridiculous idea. I think they're struck by the power of social contagion, and I hope they leave the class thinking more carefully about some similar sort of mistaken ideas about reality that are compelling a lot of antisocial behavior in the United States right now.
And as someone who studies and teaches American history, what do you most want people to sort of take away or understand about the history of witches?
I want them to understand that women were vulnerable and to maybe interrogate the human desire to persecute people who are, for whatever reason, sort of not at the center of decision-making in their societies. They're marginalized in some respects, maybe through their sex, maybe they're economically precarious. I want them to think about not just the history, but also about the kind of deep patterns in human nature that lead us to do these things.
That's Ann Little, who teaches about the history of witchcraft and witch hunts at CSU. If you like that interview, you can find all of our In The NoCo conversations at KUNC.org or anywhere you listen to podcasts. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.